So yeah, want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Paul?
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be able to speak about a topic I care a lot about, which is Wikipedia, of course. I have been editing the site since since 2007, and that's way older or way long ago than I care to think about. But when I first started, I was really enthralled because my mother had mentioned it to me, and at the time, how old would I have been? 13, something like that. The thought of uh, a, an encyclopedia that anyone could edit, that I could edit, meant that I could write a lot about Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and have a kind of a creative outlet for that. And so that's how I got my start on Wikipedia, was looking at those sort of articles, things about, books and movies that I liked. And then when I went to college, I started to branch out. I still stayed heavily in the pop culture sphere, but I eventually started to work on articles about like Latin literature and animal species, just things that I kind of was interested in or that came into my life. And I thought, oh, hey, this would make a cool project. So I've been doing that for a while. I also worked with the University of Pennsylvania a couple years ago as a Wikipedia in residence, which basically means that they gave me the keys to their library and let me just edit some articles based on those resources they had. So that was a really cool experience and something that I would not have thought was possible, prior to hearing about the concept of a Wikipedian in residence. And I've noticed that in higher ed that there's an increased interest in Wikipedia. More and more professors are kind of trying to work it into the curriculum or that they're working with to have students improve articles or fact check them or something like that. So it's a very interesting website that I'm really happy to be a part of. I'm really happy to talk about, and I'm really happy to see that people are interested in. And so today what I thought I would do is go over kind of just the basics of Wikipedia, sort of the behind the scenes stuff that you might not be super familiar with or know a lot about. I'll talk about, how to set up an account, what editors do, what it looks like, behind the scenes, all that really exciting stuff. And I'm more than happy to field questions if any of you have any inquiries about Wikipedia experience. I'm more than happy to talk about that. I will also note that I am currently working on my dissertation at Emporia State for library school, and I'm studying Wikipedia, and I'm actually studying fan editors. So it's sort of a full circle back to my start, so that's been a fun experience. I also will say I'm not an admin, if anyone's curious. I'm just a regular, boring user that has been on there for a long time. But I do know a lot of sort of the behind the scenes details. So I think I'm going to go ahead and get started and jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. I made my computer big so that, there we go, so that people can see it a little better. Okay. Well, first thing, actually, what I want to do is I want to go to just wikipedia.org and point out the fact that Wikipedia actually refers to kind of a constellation of websites. The English Wikipedia is the largest with, almost 6.5 million articles, but there's a whole variety of other Wikipedia language variants out there. And so if you're interested in contributing to the Spanish Wikipedia, for instance, there's, one for Spanish. If you're interested in German, there's one for German. There's even one for Latin, classical and ecclesiastic Latin. So if you're interested in contributing to that, that's there. It's called Wikipedia with a V. Depends on how you pronounce, your V's. If you're going with classical W or ecclesiastic V, but either way, I think it's a funny pun. But I'm going to focus most of my attention on that English side of things, just because that's the side I'm most comfortable with. All of the other sites work pretty much exactly the same. But if you go to Wikipedia, many of you have probably been on what's called the main page here, but you might not have known exactly what's going on. And that's okay because there is a lot of stuff going on. But what I want to direct your attention to first off is this today's featured article section right here. We'll dive into featured articles here in a bit, but what people might not realize is that there are peer review processes on Wikipedia to ensure that, content is of quality. And if an article passes a specific criteria or meets specific criteria, it's promoted to a featured article, which is like the best that the site has to offer. So anytime that you go to the main page here and you see that featured article, basically it's sort of a little show off area, showcase, showing you a specific topic that some editor or a group of editors were really interested in, and they sort of cleaned it up and got it, nice and worked on and got it promoted. And so that's on the front page. There's a new one every day. And they also keep kind of a sort of a history and archive of the previous articles that have been considered for today's featured article. I believe that 2 of my articles have been on the front page, one of which was about an episode of the X-Files, and another one was about a Latin poem. So kind of different things, but still a cool experience. You can track how many people visit an article and you can see the numbers just shoot up. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit about sort of the anatomy of a Wikipedia article. Like, what is going on there? When you go to Wikipedia, what exactly is it that you're seeing? So let's go to one of my favorite articles. And this is one of my favorite articles only because this picture is hilarious to me. I don't know what's going on there. I'm sure it was like trying to be scary, but I just find it really funny. So we're going to use this as sort of the sample article. So if you've ever used an old, like an old school Encyclopedia Britannica or World Book or something, you'll know that a lot of encyclopedia entries are actually pretty short, just like a paragraph or two. Whereas Wikipedia articles can often be, as you can see, like lots of information, lots of content here. And what Wikipedia does that I think is particularly interesting is that it combines that sort of abbreviated version that you see in old text-based encyclopedias with an expansive sort of digital version that is exhaustive. And so that little short area, the short encyclopedia entry, is going to basically be this lead section here, which is just a few paragraphs. This section summarizes the content of the article. So all of the information that is featured, or at least the important bits that are featured in this article here, are kind of summed up in these first few paragraphs. And you might notice that there's no sources to any of this stuff, and that's because all of this content is sourced in detail later on in the article. So I often hear that people will go to an article and say, see, look, it says this fact, but there's no source at the end of that statement. And while that's true, that's just the case generally for this introductory section. If you scroll down, usually you'll hit a table of contents kind of feature here. And this is where the actual sort of intense, I guess you could say, Wikipedia content begins. And as you can see for this example, the little brown bat, we have a section that's just dedicated, like where, how was it named? And then here you're going to see that we're starting to have sourcing. Wikipedia is fundamentally a source-based website, which means that in order for content to get on the website, an editor needs to add it along with a reference to back it up. You will find articles that are unreferenced or unsourced, and those are the articles that I generally recommend people kind of stay away from, or at least be cautious of. But an article like this, for instance, if we scroll down and we want to know more about the external characteristics of the little brown bat, you'll see that we have all these body measurements and then this footnote. And if you hover over that footnote, it's going to bring up a pop-up box that is telling you where that information is coming from. You can also click on that little footnote and it'll take you down to the bottom of the page where all the references are listed. And so now you have access, you have at least all of the bibliographic information you need to kind of track this down. And in this case, for this specific reference, we actually have a link that'll take us directly to the PDF in question. So the first thing I always tell people when they ask about, like, can you trust Wikipedia? My answer is always, well, you shouldn't just take what you see on Wikipedia on blind faith, but check out those references and see what exactly is going on. Because, if this specific fact right here about, myotis meaning mouse-eared is actually in this Wild Mammals of Missouri book, you can go to that Wild Mammals of Missouri book and verify that the information is there, actually is there, and not just sort of a made up statement that has a number tacked onto the end. But as you can see, there's all sorts of references. This article right here is an example of a good article, which means that it has been reviewed by one other editor on the site. And you'll be able to recognize a good article if, when you go to it, you see a little green disc in the upper right-hand corner. That's sort of the symbol that said that someone else has vetted this. It's not perfect. There's still going to probably be errors here and there, but for the most part, it's a pretty decent article. So if you see that little green dot, that's sort of your ticket or your sign that the article you have in front of you is pretty decent. I mentioned the featured article earlier. That's going to have a very similar icon. Instead of a green circle, though, it's a gold star. And a featured article is one that has been peer reviewed by a whole bunch of editors. And I'll show you, like I said, some of the behind the scenes details on how that happens here in just a second. But I wanted to finish up with kind of the overview of Wikipedia articles. One thing to mention is that the images on Wikipedia, with a few exceptions, are all free to use, as is the text. So if you were to copy the entirety of this article and start to sell it in a book or something, obviously you'd probably want to, say, hey, I took this from Wikipedia just for, to clear the air with authorship and stuff like that. But it's actually free to use. You can publish it and you can make money off of it without having to ask anyone. The licensing for the site explicitly allows that. And all of these images here, the same way. You'll see that they have like here, when I click on it, we have a little CC BY essay. That basically is just fancy legal talk for you can use this as long as you credit it. You can use it for commercial purposes as long as you credit it, and often as long as you release the image or the text under the same license. So that's something to think about, that not only is this free to access, but it's actually free to use and free to reuse across a wide variety of formats, which is not every day that you see something like that. Let's see. Each of these articles is usually broken up into little sections and then subsections to make it easier to navigate. And then at the very bottom of the page is where you're going to have your list of references and all sorts of good stuff that's going to take you to the scholarship that backs up the statements on the page. So for a little, like a more interesting, maybe less batty example, let me go to trying to think of a good article to demonstrate. Let's go with a tried and true classic, an article that I helped promote. This show was on when I was a kid. It terrified the just ever living stuffings out of me. And when I got into college, I started watching it, and I really, really came to like it. And it's funny looking back on it, considering how, I mean, it is pretty freaky, but there's a lot of episodes that are pretty darn hokey because this is a 90s sci-fi show after all. Anyway, I got really into the X-Files in college and worked on the X-Files. There was a project that actually a bunch of different editors came together, and we kind of improved the articles about the series. And you'll notice that for this one, we have that green circle, which means that it was a good article, that it passed that review. But here's a good example of a more kind of pop culture article that's not as rigorously sourced to scholarship as it is to popular sources like websites. So if I hover over this little this number here, it actually looks like that is a book citation. So there are some books being used to source this article. Yeah, but you'll see that there's also like websites and New York Times articles. So a little more accessible in terms of what we're dealing with here. But the same basic layout is true. You're going to have that intro section that sort of summarizes the contents. You're going to have the main body section that's broken down into specific subject matters. That really goes into detail about specific topics. And then at the very bottom of the page, you're going to have your list of references that you can always go to and verify to see if information is correct or not. If you find incorrect information, what I usually tell people is that instead of reporting it or telling me that you found incorrect information, you should try to edit it and fix it. And then people always ask, okay, that's cool, but how do you do that? And that's a great question. And that's where we're going to segue to now, actually contributing to Wikipedia. How do you add content, remove content, put your own spin on an article? How do you do that? And it's actually easier than you might realize. So at the very top of every Wikipedia article, regardless if you have an account or not, there is normally going to be an edit button. And if you click on that edit button, it's going to open up a new, this is sort of new. This is called the visual editor. It's going to open the visual editor up. And what the visual editor does is it basically preserves all of the formatting and the wiki text stuff so that you don't have to kind of figure out how the code works. You can just go to the text and modify it and make changes. Previously, when you click edit, it would take you to a page that looks something like this, which is just not very user-friendly at all because it's wiki markup kind of coding, not, super rigorous, but still content that's not, wonderful if you've never dealt with it before. So when you click edit at the top of the article, it will instead log you into the visual editor. And what you can do here is you can just go to a section or a sentence or something, and you could type out. Now, I'm not going to save this because I don't want to vandalize the article, but you can just type out a sentence, and that's all you have to do. Then you can hit that Publish Changes button, and the web page will update to reflect the new version, the new edit that you've made. And it's really that fast. So you can go in and make a change or delete stuff or add stuff really, really quickly, and that new version will be up almost instantaneously. Wikipedia actually logs every version of an article in a history section. So if you ever want to dig through the archives and find how the articles have kind of like evolved and mutated over the ages, you can definitely do that. But for right now, I just want to talk more about this visual editing and the formatting tools here. You'll notice that Wikipedia connects, you can click on these little blue links and it will take you to a different Wikipedia article. And those blue links are called wiki links. Blue links mean that there's an article that actually exists. If you ever see a red link, that means that an article doesn't exist but could potentially. And you can add a link to one of those articles by going to opening up the visual editor like I did. I hit edit, going to a section like this, for instance, and highlighting what you want to link. So the X-Files, I want to believe that was a movie that came out, I want to say in 2007. So I highlighted that, and now I can click on, you'll see there's a little, looks like paperclip, but I think it's supposed to be chain link. If you click on that, it's going to tell you, oh, this is how you add links. Okay, got it. That's the first time you do it. Now we have the option. It defaults to Wikipedia, which means that it's going to be looking for Wikipedia articles. And then all you have to do is type in the name of the article or the kind of a general name of the article that you're interested in linking. So I could put, I want to believe. And you'll see that here we go. There is the X-Files, I want to believe. There's an article with that name. It's a 2008 science fiction film. So if I click on that, it will add that blue hyperlink into the article. And when I hit publish, people would be able to actually click on that hyperlink. In fact, I can show you. If I hit publish changes, since it's not really vandalizing to add a link anywhere, it might take a second. But when you click that publish changes button, what did it do? Oh, it redirected me back to this. Well, normally that doesn't happen. Yeah, well, sorry, I don't know why it redirected me to the source editor, but you'll see that the visual editor, when I hit save, it redirected me back to the main page I was on, and indeed that hyperlink is now there. That wiki link is there, and I can click on it, and it'll take me to that article. A very similar process is done to add sourcing. You click the edit button at the top, and then you just go to where you want to place your reference. On Wikipedia, references come at the end of sentences after punctuation. So a lot of people are used to kind of like APA or MLA style citing. For Wikipedia, just throw your cursor right at the end, and then you can just hit the cite button. And if you have a URL, you can just drop that URL there and hit generate, and it'll spit out a citation. You can also add in citations manually. Like if you have a book that you're wanting to source or something, you can put your cursor where you want that citation to go. Here, let me close out of this. put your cursor where you want that citation to go. You can hit that cite button and go to manual and choose book. And then just fill it out to your heart's content. Basically, this is going to be like something like EasyBib, if you've ever used that online, where you just provide like last name, first name, title of the book, publisher. And then when you hit the insert button, it will drop in a nice little reference for you. It'll kind of put all the pieces into place, so you don't have to remember that, you know, author name goes before date or anything like that. It'll do all that fun stuff for you. But you still have to provide the information. So if you're working with web sources, that's why when you hit cite, I always emphasize that automatic option, because you can just drop a URL in there and hit enter, and it will spit out a little citation for you. You'll notice that I'm editing just, I don't have an account. I'm just editing as what's known as I'm anonymously as an IP user. And for the most part, you can do most things on Wikipedia without a user account. There are some exceptions, though. You can't upload images, unfortunately, and you also can't edit like very highly visited articles, just because those they tend to be vandalized. So the Wikipedia admins have kind of locked that down. If you want to create an account and then therefore edit, you know, beyond the capabilities that I've just shown you here, if you just go to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that there is a create account link. If you click on that, it will ask for a username and a password and then an email address if you want to link it up with your email. And that's all you need. You got to also fill out a CAPTCHA to show you're not a robot. But you just need a username and a password. And they recommend that you don't use your real name. Don't use, you know, passwords that are likely to be leaked or not leaked exactly, but, you know, guessed or something like that. And so you can be creative and as fun as you want when you set up your account. Although I will caution you that depending on if you're serious or not, you're going to probably be stuck with that name for a long time. So if you're like me, and you're 13 or whatever, and you want to create an account and you decide to use your Lord of the Rings fan fiction character name, just remember that you're still probably going to be editing with that account, you know, years on down the line. As you can see, I am. Of course, I'm not really like embarrassed by that fact. I find it more of a funny anecdote, but I do know some people whose usernames are kind of goofy, and they're like, "Oh, I wish I had known that when I set up the account," because you know that's kind of a dumb name. But you know, to each their own. When you if you do create an account, and to log in, all you have to do is go to the upper right-hand corner and hit that login button, and just punch in your username and password, like I did here. And it'll redirect you back to the page you were previously on, and it's not going to look substantially different. The biggest difference that I've noticed is that you're going to have these tools up here that kind of allow you to keep track of things a little easier, and you can actually talk to other editors. You can communicate them on what's known as a talk page, and so that is kind of the next angle I want to talk about. Like, what exactly do Wikipedia editors do? How do they work together? You know, how many are there? You know, what are they doing? And the answer to those questions are there's many, but basically Wikipedia editors are always kind of behind the scenes. They're usually working on articles that they're interested in. So I, for instance, am largely interested in articles about movies and television shows, music, and like I said, Latin poetry and bats. So kind of a random variety. But if you were to go to this link right here, if you just typed in this page right here, user::Jin::Quan, this will take you to my sort of personal, for lack of a better term, Wikipedia profile. And I've basically just sort of kind of laid out a little bit about myself, like what I'm interested in editing, what I've done, you know, what I'm doing with regard to Wikipedia and with graduate school and that sort of thing. And then I also have a little space where I brag a little bit and I show off some of the featured articles that I have helped create, as well as the good articles that I've helped create. And there's actually quite a ton of those for television, especially. I'm a big fan of TV. So this is kind of just my area to brag. But if you were to go to the talk portal here, if you log in and create an account and hit talk, that's going to take you to your user talk page. So this is mine, since I clicked on the talk link here. Obviously, if you clicked on your talk link, it would take you to your page, not mine. But this is where editors communicate with one another. So here's a good example. Someone created a new section just by clicking that new section button at the top. And then they asked me to, I believe, just sort of like copy edit the article, the BTS article about the Korean pop band. And I was a little busy, so I wasn't able to give it a ton of attention as I answered here, but you'll see that I just sort of responded with some text, and they responded with, their answers. To actually add a message or to sign a message, if I were to go down here, I could click on the edit source link next to the heading in question. And here's that scary source editor that I was talking about. What you'd want to do is you just scroll down to the very bottom and just type your message. And then if you type dash dash and then tilde, 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 or as I like to call it, squiggle, 4 squiggles, 2 dashes and 4 squiggles, when you hit publish, it will add your text there, and then it will sign it with your signature. Of course, this is a little more advanced than a lot of people, are expecting when they first get introduced to Wikipedia. So I don't want to throw you into the deep end here and say, oh, well, now you know how to make an account. Go start promoting articles. I just kind of wanted to show you how exactly that works. If we go back to my user page here, you'll see that like I said, I've linked a lot of the stuff I'm interested in. Pending nominations, I don't. But I could, let's find a good sample. Yeah, let's use this. This is, I think, my last article that I actually promoted to good article status. Just an album by a band I really enjoy. At the very top, whenever you go to an article, it's going to default to the article tab, but you'll notice that there's also a talk tab kind of hanging out in the background there. And if you click on that, it's going to take you, much like with the user talk page, it's going to take you to the article talk page, where you can actually see sort of the behind the scenes discussions that editors have with one another. So this is the actual good article review that that this article went under, and this editor here just sort of combed through the text and said like, oh hey, this text right here, you've got an issue, you need to change this, copy edit it, add a link or whatever. And I've I responded by making some comments, and basically it was a back and forth until this reviewer decided that the article was good enough, and then they passed it, and I got the little green shield icon. So that's really exciting. So if you're ever curious to see sort of the drama that goes on behind the scenes, if you go to that talk page, you can often find some interesting arguments. Likewise, I mentioned that there's basically a page archived there's an archived page of every Wikipedia iteration, and that can be accessed by going to the View History button right there. And this is going to tell you the date, the editor, and then like how much information they modified. And so as you can see, the last few edits to this page have been on the July 1st, July 7th, July 9th, and July 10th. And they were all by me, and they were pretty minor. You can see the numbers aren't moving substantially. But you can actually compare between revisions. So I can compare by clicking on these little dots here. I can select one from the 25th of June, select the other from July 10th, and hit compare. And it's actually going to tell me, what differences were made here. So you can see that this is the raw text, and it's actually showing what I added or removed, which is really cool and very useful when you're tracking down vandals, because you can see exactly where they added something. And speaking of vandalism, I often get asked like, okay, well, how do you keep track and make sure that people like aren't vandalizing your articles constantly? And it's a good question. And the answer is that if you're a more established editor, you can set up what's known as a watch list. You'll see there's that nice little star icon right there at the top of the article. The watch list, as its name suggests, adds it to a feature called the watch list that you have when you're an editor, right up here next to talk, a few links over. And it's going to, when you add that article to your watch list, it's going to basically keep a log. If any changes have been made, it's going to tell you which editor made a change, when they did it. So you'll see, for instance, here's another album by that band, Pale Waves. You'll see that this person here added what looks like 1+1 data bit or byte, I guess. And I can actually see what's going on here. If I click the diff link, it's going to show me the before and after. And it looks like, yeah, they basically corrected a typo. This is supposed to be reasons to live. And you'll see that it previously said reason to live. And so they added that S and fixed that for us. So that's a good edit. You know, that gets the thumbs up. I don't need to do anything there. Sometimes though, you'll see a notification that someone has edited an article, and you click on it and it's just vandalism. In that case, that's how we know to go to that article and undo it, or to remove the sort of nonsense or whatever it was that was added to the page. We can just kind of get rid of it really fast. So this is basically how Wikipedia editors keep everything under control. Everyone sort of has their own different little area of interest that they're sort of monitoring. And mine is like, you know, television shows, all of the episodes of The Office, all of the episodes of Adventure Time, the band Pale Waves, pretty much every article about Weird Al, and like I said, some weird Latin literature pages. You know, I'm keeping my eyes on those. And more often than not, nothing bad happens. But occasionally you get someone who goes in and vandalizes it. And the funny thing about vandals is that they're never subtle. They always will delete all of the content and just write the F word or something, you know, and they think that's, you know, really clever. It takes about 2 seconds to undo. Frankly, I like that they're not very clever, because it makes it very easy to find, you know, where that vandalism is happening. But yeah, so that's a question I often get, like, how exactly do you know? And another thing I always like to caution people about with Wikipedia is that when you go to an article and you see that it looks pretty solid, like there's a lot of content, there's a lot of footnotes, we have links. If you go down to the references, that is like all nicely formatted. Normally that's the sign that an article is going to be, I don't want to say trustworthy in the sense that you should just put blind faith into it, but, you know, decent to use if you're in kind of a low stakes situation. You want to know, you know, who wrote a specific song, or what year a movie came out or something like that. An article that looks like this, that's illustrated and has all these like nice graphics and stuff, is probably going to be a pretty safe bet to use. Whereas if you go to an article that has no references, nothing's linked, there's no images, it's really short or something like that, you know, be careful with those. But I also want to point out that even nice looking articles can basically be problems. So there is actually a list of hoaxes on Wikipedia, basically a guide of an archived version of, or archive of the various hoaxes that people have created, like articles about things that don't exist. The site's created this basically, I guess you could say, kind of to publicly shame ourselves. Like, we need to be better at figuring out like the nonsense information. And some of these articles were around for 10 plus years. Oh, wow. So when was this discovered? Is this ongoing? 10 plus years. Wow. So it's been around for a long time. But these are all like articles that at one point were live on the page that they then discovered weren't not actually real. My favorite one of these is this one right here, the Bichilum conflict or Bicolum conflict. I'm not exactly sure how you're supposed to pronounce it because it's made up. But if you go to that, like I said, the archived version, it actually looks pretty good. You know, they have all these like nice graphics. They've got images. We've got footnotes and links. If you go down to the bottom, there's a reference section, and with all these fancy like Latin abbreviations. So it looks like someone did their homework. And this was up there for a long time. And the only reason that it got discovered is because someone nominated it for good article status. And I think it very nearly passed. But there was the issue where you'll see that like this one source here is being used a whole bunch of times. Each one of those little letters means that's a different like a different little footnote being used on the page. And so the editor said, okay, well, we should probably find page numbers. Since we're using this book a lot, we should find page numbers and break that down. And so the person took that ISBN number right there and looked it up. And turns out that there was not a book with that name that existed. That was not real. So then they tried with some of these other ones, like this one right here, that book. if it wasn't real, it was real, but there was like no mention of this conflict in the text. And so they figured out that none of these references were real. These were all just made up references. And this is all pretty detailed information that's not blatantly false. So someone obviously took their time to go through, wrote up a fictitious battle between two, which is like I believe it was supposed to be in, like 17th century India, between the Portuguese Empire and the indigenous inhabitants. And they put a lot of work into basically making something up. And so people can fool you. And that's what I always like to show people this, because like, you should always go to those sources when you're doing a project or doing research. If it's really serious, you should always go to the sources in an article and see what they have to say. Use Wikipedia first and foremost as a finding aid to find that valuable information, and then go to that information and use it and critique it and see if it's accurate. The problem with Wikipedia is when people stop at Wikipedia and don't do anything else, because that's where you kind of get into the issues with, maybe misinterpreting sources or just blatant mistakes that are getting interpreted as factual. But thankfully, those sort of hoax articles and very subtle instances of vandalism are not super, super common. So most articles on Wikipedia are decent in my experience. The information is pretty much what the sources say. You can usually tell when something's kind of sketchy sounding or not real. But again, I would always recommend that you defer to those sources, because the sources have been vetted by, publishers. They've been fact checked. They've been copy edited. They were held to a really high standard that then Wikipedia takes that information and then makes it a little more accessible to people. There's still that review process with editors coming in and kind of cleaning stuff up and monitoring pages to make sure that vandalism isn't rampant or anything like that. But at the end of the day, it's still, a user-created website. And so that's my thoughts on Wikipedia are both positive and a little bit negative. In the positive sense, I think it's a great invention. The fact that anyone can write anything, pretty much anything, on the encyclopedia, as long as they have like a source backing it up, is phenomenal in terms of preserving knowledge, because there's no other extant body of research that's as unified as Wikipedia in the world. I mean, what is it? There's 6.5 million articles in the English version alone. That's astounding. I think that there were some, encyclopedias back in the day that, and in fact, I talk about them. I can't remember off the top of my head their names, but there were some that were, like thousands of volumes long, but we're talking millions and even more words. That's wonderful and fantastic. And like I said, the fact that anyone can kind of access it and edit it is really, really remarkable, because information is not equally distributed on Earth. That some people have a lot of access to it. Like, for instance, I work at a university library, so I have access to the internet. I also have access to databases and books and all that stuff. And then there are people that don't have access to hardly anything. They don't have access to the internet. And if they do, they just have access to the internet. They don't have subscriptions to any sort of information sources. And Wikipedia is a free portal to a lot of amazing, wonderful, realms of knowledge. And for some people, it's all they have. And so I have a commitment to trying to make the information on Wikipedia as reliable and rigorously sourced as possible. At the same time, since anyone can edit it, I always caution people, don't go in just believing everything you see. Check the references, check the writing, make sure that that's up to par. And sometimes the references themselves can maybe they're misinterpreted, or they're older, so like newer research has come out that editors haven't worked with yet. So there's always room for improvement. And like I said, if you ever see an error, instead of just reporting it or telling someone, you can always go to that article and hit that edit button, and you can set up an account and you can start editing, because we want more people to edit. That's the goal. We don't want to run people off. It's just we want to ensure that the quality of the encyclopedia is really good. So sometimes you can get into like little minor altercations with other editors about the dumb stuff in the grand scheme of things. And if that ever has happened to you or happens to you, that's an area where I'd like to just say that try to brush it off. look past it and keep on editing. Worst case scenario, you can always just drop me a message on my user page, and I'm more than happy to help you, walk you through the process, or talk to the editor if you're in some sort of spat. Normally, like 9 times out of 10, whenever an argument breaks out on Wikipedia, it can be negotiated peacefully if everyone just kind of calms down and approaches it from that perspective of trying to make peace rather than fighting with someone else. In my time in Wikipedia, I can't think of any instances where I've had like a huge blowout where you know, me and another editor were just like throwing verbal punches at one another, because if you do that, you can get banned. And then I should also mention, there's like, you know, rules. You have to obey the rules. You can't be a jerk, basically. You want to try to, you know, you want to contribute information that's good. You don't want to spam pages with self-promotion. You need to always have references to back up your sourcing, and you need to get along with other people, or at least be relatively friendly. That will take you so far. Just being a decent human will allow you to really get pretty involved with Wikipedia. And like I said, I've been doing this since 2007. I still do it every day. I don't know how many edits I've made. There, you can actually log that, contributions. We can see, I think I'm probably, this has been a slower month, so maybe in the hundreds for July. But there was one month in college, and I can actually show you. Yeah, so this is 2022. I've only made 1,600 edits. And this month so far, I've made 325, which actually is pretty decent. But there was one month way back in 2012 where I made, what was that? Almost 2,200, over 2,200 edits just in the month of June. That was when I was just like super into the site and going to town and having a great time. As you can see, my numbers shot up, then they kind of descended, got lower, and they've sort of plateaued a little bit. Also, this is when I started my PhD program. So as you can see, whoop, and then it plateaus again. But ever since I've started my dissertation, my numbers have kind of gone up a little bit, because as part of my dissertation, I'm actually editing and sort of keeping track of my experiences that I've had with people on there. So that's been fun. So at this point, I'd love to open this up to any questions, or if there are comments that people have, anything like that. I'm more than happy to go over, you know, something I talked about or mentioned. If there's a desire to hear something again, I'm happy to work through step by step, you know, any of the features that I've talked about. So if there is anything.
Yeah, thank you. This is really fascinating. So yeah, those of you watching virtually, you can type in the chat if you have any questions or comments, and then you have a question. But we've got one on the Facebook. Sarah asks, does Wikipedia ban IP addresses of known vandals from future editing?
That's a great question. And the answer is that they often do. And because of that, if you are setting up an account like at a school or a library IP, sometimes those IPs can be blocked. Maybe not permanently, but like sort of preemptively. That's usually because those IPs are, like I said, heavily they're used by vandals. Like a school, you're going to have a lot of kids. Kids love to vandalize Wikipedia, so often those IPs are blocked. And the way to get around that is just to create an account. It's probably the best way, because once you create that account, the account name matters rather than the IP. So when I log in at like the University of Kansas and I log my username in, I can edit and everything, but there are some IPs that I know, that IP addresses that are blocked. So yeah, that's a great question. And it's usually, because of just vandalism.
And I have a question. You know, we've got a pretty active genealogy, family history research community group here, and of course that also bleeds over into local history.
Yeah.
So if those folks would be interested in trying to add some of what they've learned to Wikipedia, like what do they need to know about the kind of sources that can and can't be used, as well as what's considered notable or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so one of the big sort of determining factors, like you mentioned, is notability. In order for something to be on Wikipedia, it needs to be demonstrated that it it matters, basically. And that's kind of mean because there's a lot of things out there that matter to me that I probably would never be on like will never make it onto a Wikipedia article. But that's the way the site sort of corrals it and keeps it bounded from just expanding into like anything. So what I've usually found when you're working with local history in particular, because this is an area that I think Wikipedia suffers from. In fact, I think history in general suffers from, because local history is often seen kind of like small potatoes, oh, that's just the country folk or whatever. It's not the movers and shakers of history. And I don't believe that. I don't subscribe to that belief. I think that there's a lot of really amazing, valuable, fascinating information out there. So if you're interested in improving content about local history, things like books, and journal articles from academic sources are, of course, wonderful. But newspaper clippings, reports from probably reports from the Historical Society, if maybe even if a library had like a report that they issued, that might be considered reliable. Basically, it needs to be published in some form, which kind of includes everything other than like one person making it and then releasing it themselves. So you would want to have basically some sort of organization behind it, issuing it. So one thing I've suggested in the past is to work with libraries to create content that maybe isn't in like books and journal articles, but that could be peer reviewed or looked at by experts in the area and then issued or sort of officially published by libraries or local historical societies, reports that could then be used on Wikipedia as sort of where this information is coming from. There's a lot of material in archives that can still be used, like photographs, for instance. If they're old enough, you can upload them without worrying about copyright. And there's so many cool little bits and pieces from small town history and or even large town history that are lying in historical archives. So yeah, basically just if you're gonna add stuff to Wikipedia, make sure that it's something that has been talked about, and then also try to use those sources that have been issued by some sort of organization with clout or reputation in the area. Like I said, libraries, university programs, government reports, stuff like that. And that's kind of the secret to getting things on the site. And also, if someone wants to delete, they want to nominate an article for deletion, they can. It doesn't really, it's not like, you have a threshold where they can't do anything against you. They could still nominate it for deletion, but that's when you could jump in there and defend it. And there's people that would probably come in and say, oh, hey, if this is sourced and this is interesting, why are we getting rid of it? So that's the thing I often caution people. Don't get your feelings hurt too much if something gets deleted or removed. Wikipedia is never going to be finished. That means that it's never, there's never going to be that one last golden spike that we kind of put into the ground. Things are constantly getting rewritten and redone and remixed and added and deleted. And so that can be weird and kind of strange to get used to. But yeah, so just be bold and have some fun with it and see what other people say. And if they say that you need better sourcing, try to find better sourcing or figure out a way for the, like I said, local organizations to help you out. But that's one area that I am actually very fascinated by. Local history is often forgotten. And I think that Wikipedia would benefit so much from that information. Let's see. Was there another question? I thought I heard speak.
Yeah, from the room here. Does Wiki Tree have any relationship to Wikipedia, or is it just the word wiki?
Wiki what was that one?
Wiki Tree? Is that a
Wiki
genealogy?
Tree.
Yeah, it's a genealogy site.
Let's find out. So that's another good question. I'm assuming, is this the one? So if this is the one, let's see if they, okay. So wiki refers to a type of website that basically means anyone can go in and edit it. Wikipedia is arguably the most famous of the wikis out there. There's a whole variety, some of which are affiliated with Wikipedia, some of which aren't. This one looks like it might not be a Wikipedia affiliate. Let's see if there's a Wikipedia article on it. Oh, okay, yeah. So it's okay. So it looks like Yeah, it uses this is what Wikipedia has to say, so it could always be wrong, but it uses the same basic software that Wikipedia does. But I don't. It's privately held, so it's not associated with Wikipedia. But that doesn't mean that it's bad or good either way. It might be actually a very awesome, wonderful source. I just can't vouch to its reliability. But since it does use that wiki markup, it means that they encourage people to add and contribute information to it, which is good in my opinion.
Yeah. Let's see. Question in the chat. How many actual employees does Wikipedia have?
Oh, let's see. They have. I think you can. Let's see. It's the Wikimedia Foundation is the technical name, and I think they have like 20. Like it's not very many. Let's see if they say on here, and that's because oh, I guess I was wrong. Not 20, 550. Still, that's not a ton considering how big this site is. And basically, the reason for that is that the people who run Wikimedia Foundation and stuff like that are working largely on the software and the server maintenance and stuff like that. They're not actively editing the site. In fact, a lot of times you'll hear people discouraged from paid editing. So like if someone was like, I'll give you $20 to make an article for me, that's sort of discouraged because it's seen as, like a conflict of interest. That said, there are some funds out there that, like when I was a Wikipedia scholar in residence, I got a small little honorarium that, it was just kind of a thank you award, which was cool. I wasn't expecting that. So it wasn't one of those things where I knew I was going to get a little bit of money to edit. The big thing usually is just transparency about that sort of thing. So if you have a fund or like some sort of scholarship or something to improve certain topics, as long as you're upfront about it and let people know, that's not a huge issue. But in terms of actual editors, like people that work on the site who are not paid, it's somewhere in it's definitely in the thousands in terms of active. They have actually statistics. Here we go. Users. Oh wow, what is that? Oh boy, scientific notation has been a while. Is that 4 billion people? Yeah. So that's how many users there are. This is how many active editors there are. So usually it's, what is that going to be, like 100,000 or so? Maybe 10,000. Like I said, it's been a while since I've done scientific notation. I'd have to get the pencil out and move it over. But yeah, so there's a huge number of editors and then a slightly, actually substantially smaller number of really active editors. So, there's a bunch of accounts that did like one thing and then never did it again. But there's there's like a dedicated core of really active editors who are contributing content pretty regularly, of which I happen to be one of. I'm pretty proud of the fact that on the list of, let's see, I'm not entirely sure. Oh, that's article creation. Okay, so in terms of edits, I should be on here. Yes, I am the 1425 in terms of like rank. So 1425th place. I have made almost 64,000 edits. The top Wikipedia editor of all time, the person who has made the most edits, oh my gosh, is at an astounding 5 million. Dang, that is a lot of edits. Huh. They've probably been there for a while. So yeah,
runs a bot or something like that.
That's possible. I wonder. Let's see. I can go to their user page because that is a kind of an absurd number. I don't know. Huh. Wow. Wikinome, they're a Wikinome. That's just a fun term for like someone who does minor edits to a whole bunch of articles. Like they go in and copy edit stuff that they have no interest in, or not that they don't have an interest in, but like tiny things. And so edit counts are kind of arbitrary because you could go in, hit edit, and make one giant edit that completely overhauls an article, and it would count as one edit. And you could go in and make 40 really tiny edits that do nothing, and that kind of skews like which one looks more active. So they don't that doesn't tell you all the information, but that's still an absurd number of edits.
Yeah, that's something. So yeah, I was curious, more on a personal note, you said you started doing this at 13, and of course now you're a librarian and you're about to get your PhD in library science. So do you think that Wikipedia is what kind of led you to this career path?
100%. Absolutely. When I went to college, I was an anthropology and classics student, hence the Latin interest in Latin.
Mhm.
But what I found myself doing in my free time was editing Wikipedia. And when I was getting ready to go to graduate school for a master's degree, I was like, what do I want to study? Because I still was sort of set on anthropology. And I thought, well, why don't I study like Wikipedia editors, like the anthropological sort of situatedness of that. And I found that anthropology, that field, was just not quite the right fit for what I wanted to do. And then I got a job at KU Libraries, and they were really interested in Wikipedia, and they were kind of excited to work that into some of the stuff that we've done. And so I started to look into library science, and they were also receptive. And so that kind of just guided me towards Emporia's program. And yeah, I credit Wikipedia 100%, because when I remember sitting down to write that essay, like, what do I want to do in graduate school? And I was like, well, I like Wikipedia. Maybe I should study Wikipedia. And I've been doing that ever since. So that's funny. Yeah, I guess I never really consciously put that together, but yeah, 13 years old, that was kind of the moment that I charted my future in ways that I didn't even realize, but don't regret it. I've had a lot of fun.
Yeah. And I guess one other question I have, obviously editing Wikipedia and you find all this information about like all these articles that you brought up to good status. You obviously have to find all that information and organize it and learn it in a sense in order to write these articles. So what advice do you have for like people that are just an
Just
average
started.
user just trying to find info to do that more effectively?
Yeah. So in terms of like improving articles or
Improving articles are just trying to find the information on the internet that you want or are interested
I
in.
see, gotcha. So if you're just starting out, what I generally recommend is that you not stick to, you can do whatever you want, but you focus largely on small changes first, kind of just to get used to Wikipedia. So, maybe go to this webpage or something and maybe there's a typo or something, click that edit button and fix it. And you'll start to get more and more familiar with how Wikipedia works. And then at that point, I'd say you can start adding references and links and that sort of stuff, or you can jump in and do that immediately too if you're comfortable. But in terms of finding content, Wikipedia wants references that are reliable and basically published by a reputable source. So what I always do, I usually start off with like a Google Scholar search or a Google book search, because publishers of books are usually reliable. Same with scholarship from Google Scholar. But you can kind of judge it based on the nature of the site and basically like figuring out who owns it or what the situation. So like Wiki Tree here, for instance, I went down to the bottom. That was the first thing I did. I wanted to see if it had any information about who owns it or contributes to it. And you'll see that right there, it says like it's owned by interesting.com and that it's created by the Wiki Tree community members. So because I went down there and checked that out, I know, okay, so this is probably like a anyone can contribute sort of source, which is not bad by any means, but it's the sort of source that you probably wouldn't want to use for a Wikipedia article as a reference, because since anyone can edit it, they could edit the reference and then edit the article, and it's like a big loop, a never-ending loop of doom. I also like to stick to sources that are known, so like newspapers, publishers that have a history of fact checking, of reliability. A lot of the major news networks out there will satisfy that criteria. Usually you'll run into issues with like in terms of news, if it's like political commentary and discussion, that can often kind of, depending on how it's presented on Wikipedia, be seen as like bad editing. So if you said like a specific political person has a specific opinion, that's fine. But if you tried to sort of use like an opinion piece as like a fact, to back up a fact, that's when you might get into some issues. But yeah, like breaking news or BBC is great for that sort of stuff. Like I said, books, local libraries. I love, when I was first getting into Wikipedia, I made use of KU libraries resources, going in and finding these academic books and using them to back up articles. But you can use websites as well. You just need to know who made it and the general reliability or the trustworthiness of that person. If it's self-published, like if just one person makes it and produces it, that's where you want to be a little careful, because there's no real quality control there. But if it's a team of people, they have some sort of editorial board or a group that sort of approves or looks over content, that's when you can, those are the type of sources that you can generally trust or use. And it's also one of those things I hate saying this because it's such a non-answer, but you kind of figure it out as you go. You start to realize like, oh, this is a good source, but this one isn't as good. Or maybe both of these are technically good sources, but this one's a little better than the other. And so it is sort of just kind of experience and getting familiar with it. But, if it's something that you would trust in your day-to-day life, like I said, like a major news source or something like that, then it's generally probably a reliable source for Wikipedia.
Great. Well, do Wikipedia editors have a list? Do Wikipedia editors have a list of common self-publishing publishing houses that they hold in lower regard as a source?
Oh, that's a great question. And in fact, we do. And this is kind of getting into like the very sort of inner workings of Wikipedia. But if you go to WP, which stands for Wikipedia, it's Wikipedia space. So it's basically articles about Wikipedia. And it's, I think it's, is it RSP? I think it's RSP. Let's see. Yeah. Which stands for the, reliable sources / perennial sources. Basically, this here is a listing of websites and publishers that Wikipedia editors have come to an agreement about. And so if it's pink, that means it's not good. Usually the issue there is that it's like heavily skewed towards one side. Maybe it's like a propaganda outlet or it's just misinformation. If it's gray, that usually means it's kind of like, it's probably not the best. Maybe in some cases you can use it, but in other cases you probably shouldn't. If you see anything that's green, gray means that there was no consensus. If you see it's green, it means you're good to go. Yellow was the one that was kind of like, be careful here. And so one thing that I think is interesting is that like a lot of British newspapers, like the Daily Mail and I think the Daily Mirror is another one. Those are like Daily Mail can't use it because the fact checking on that is just so atrocious that editors have time and time again found that that it just does not hold up to the standards that Wikipedia wants. And then one that I actually saw that sort of shocked me was that Rolling Stone is on here for anything other than music. I think that's what it was. Just look up Rolling Stone. And for culture, yeah. So for Rolling Stone, anything for culture, you're fine. But if it veers into politics and society, anything from 2011 to present, you shouldn't use because, as it says, like they've kind of deteriorated in terms of the quality of their fact checking. They've had some major scandals and partisan slant issues and stuff like that. So this is a really awesome source to go to because you can see like, oh, this is a great website, but ResearchGate is not because, this is user generated. But sometimes things that you think are going to be reliable aren't. Like I said, the Daily Mail is a newspaper, so you might think it's something you can use, but other times it might sound like kind of a funny slanted source, but it's totally fine to use. I'm trying to find a good example. Yeah, nothing's jumping out. I mean,
like the Christian, the Christian Science Monitor, you might think that's a religious tract paper, but it's actually a reliable source.
Yeah, let's see. That's probably on here. So it's considered reliable. Yeah, I think you're right. It is. Is it affiliated still or Yeah, so it has, it has like an owner that's a religious affiliation, but the fact checking is really solid. So that's totally fine. That's the big thing. It's not necessarily the publisher or who made it. It's just if over time, their fact checking has held up. There's some, I'm trying to think of, I think maybe the, oh, what is the, I'm trying to think of the name of, the National Review. Oh, okay, interesting. So no consensus. I know that this is a right leaning source that I've usually seen most people say it's fine if if you are attributing like opinions to it, because it's obviously partisan, but it's done in a way that's like a little more faithful than some other sources. I think that conversely, you have something like probably, trying to think of one that's more left-leaning.
Occupy Democrats.
Yeah, that's probably one. Let's see. Yeah, so Occupy Democrats, not reliable either. So the reason I bring up kind of the right and left is because sometimes people think that Wikipedia has like a political slant, and the truth is it only has a slant based on the people who edit it. And in fact, when it comes to a lot of political discussion, a lot of the more partisan news sources are not what you want to get your information from. If, again, fact checking, you want to make sure they have a reputable history of getting the information right. And so, yeah, and then that's a delicate process. It takes some time, but yeah, this reliable sources notice board for perennial sources is super useful. There's also there is a reliable source notice board here that you can actually post and say, hey, I found this website. Do you think it's reliable? And then other editors can say, looks kind of weird, or that looks fine. They've got an editorial board or something like that. So, yeah, so there's one thing that being a Wikipedia editor has done is I think it's made me much better at discerning sourcing. And that's something that I found with editors is that they're even fan editors, people who are writing about, like video games and stuff, are good at saying like, this is a good quality source. This is not a good quality source. And it's impressive. I think that's cool that people are working to sort of suss that out and figure out where specific things lie in terms of reliability and usefulness.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's a really interesting note to end on. I didn't realize that page is a pretty neat compendium. Of course, I'm sure people are debating the contents of it constantly, sure, like everything else. But thank you so much. And yeah, if you want to get on Wikipedia, and you can General Kwan,
yeah,
and send a Wikipedia message to Paul. And thank you again for being with us. And this has really been great.
Awesome. I'm glad that I could be here. I'm sorry I wasn't in person. Like I said, an earache got me off guard, but I'm glad that I could still talk about something I love with people who are interested.
Yeah, and I think actually this worked out really well to have you here over Zoom. It's been great. So
stop that share.
Thanks a lot. I will go ahead and sign us off. Bye, everybody.
Perfect. Yeah. Have a good night.